Hello and welcome to the Ravens Brawl podcast, a part of the Brawl Network. I am your host, Dave Steinwittle. It is officially the football offseason as the NFL wrapped up with Super Bowl 54. The Kansas City Chiefs beat the San Francisco 49ers, but nobody listening to this Ravens Brawl podcast really cares about that. So we're going to discuss some stocks. And don't worry, we're not going to get into the financial market. Joe may understand the financial market. I do not. So we're not going to break down those types of stock. We'll talk some player stocks and whose value went up during the year and whose value went down during the year. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm your host, Dave Steinwell. Joe Schiller is with me. Joe, how you doing?
I'm good, Dave. In college, I invested briefly in Bitcoin for a little bit, so that's well to my stock knowledge. But when it comes to Raven stocks, I'm a lot more knowledgeable.
I honestly look at the numbers in like the stock market, and I know we have a whole podcast that discusses in the Brawl Network discusses like stocks and whatnot. I don't understand the numbers. I just look at okay, like what is that number mean? What does that number mean? And I try to follow it, and I just know if it's in the red, it's not good. That's all I need to know. We got some Raven players that are going to be in the red tonight, Joe. But first, we got to pay the bills. We got to mention our fantastic sponsors. And we're going to start with the bearsbrawl.com/fanatics is where you can go to get all the latest official gear from Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, or your college athletics. You can go to fanatics.com. Pardon me, the bearsbrawl.com/fanatics. They have all great stuff there. I know Joe and I dabble on that website. And yeah, there's some really good stuff there. We got some really good stuff coming to you that we'll tease out, Joe, at the end of the show. But let's get into our stocks. Turn it over to you.
All right, we'll go in between, I guess, go back and forth with some stock ups, and then we'll go to our stock downs. We'll each pick our 2-3 each and just make sure we're not overlapping. So my first stock up is going to be Ronnie Stanley, the Ravens left tackle. It was a huge year for him protecting Lamar Jackson's blind side. Ronnie Stanley heads into his fifth-year option next year, and as we had Russell Street Report's Brian McFarland on a couple weeks ago, said that he's a guy that is primed for an extension this offseason. He is key to that offensive line, one of the reasons why Lamar Jackson had such a breakout year in his second season, but it is so important to have a left tackle, a bookend guy like Ronnie Stanley, and he had such a great season. He is legitimately one of the most important offensive weapons on that side of the ball, and I say weapon because to be able to have a guy who can protect Lamar Jackson against pass rushers who continually get better each year they come into the league is crucial. I know Lamar Jackson is a different kind of quarterback who is able to escape pressure and sacks because of his mobility, but as he continues to improve as a pocket passer, Ronnie Stanley is that guy there, and the Ravens need to do whatever they can to keep him around. He is a guy who tremendously boosted his stock. I believe Pro Football Focus ranked him their best pass blocker of the 2019-2020 season. So for me, he's a stock up, and he's a guy who could be secure in the bag this offseason or hopefully next offseason.
Securing the bag. I like the reference, Joe. I have no complaint with that. You know me. I'm an offensive guy. Ronnie Stanley. He's not like the rest of the Baltimore Raven offensive line. He's much more what you would call a finesse blocker. And there are two types of offensive linemen that I look at and I break down and I try to impart on the high schoolers I coach, Joe, that they don't seem to grasp that, but we'll get to that later. There are two types. The brawling type of offensive lineman, which they like to just get in and mix it up with you, more run first, pass second. Ronnie Stanley is that great balance between a finesse blocker, which is really good at the technical aspects of blocking, the pass setting and all the timing that goes into those sort of blocks. And then some of the more difficult run blocks, like a reach block, a stretch block, those sorts of blocks that are a little harder for the big mauling type of lineman. And Ronnie Stanley is that perfect balance between the two. And you're absolutely right. He had a huge year, and it gets overshadowed at times because of Lamar Jackson's ability to get outside of the pocket and make these wonderful plays. But a lot of times, Ronnie Stanley made plays happen, Joe, by opening up a running lane for Lamar Jackson by blocking his guy so well, whether it was off his left shoulder or even running the guy out of the way so Jackson can step up and step outside the pocket.
I'm not a film guy, and I don't act like I'm a guy who's watching film every day, but just from a I guess you could call maybe a casual observer who's watching games on Sunday, it's just impressive to watch him. And the offensive line was such an important part of the offensive success this year. And like you said, it kind of does go unnoticed because anything that Ronnie Stanley doesn't necessarily show up in the box score under his name. But when you're a team that averages over 200 passing yards a game and 200 yards rushing a game, you got to give credit to the big guys down there in the trenches. They're obviously doing something right if your offense is definitely that successful.
Yeah, but before I get to my first stock up, I will admit, Joe, I have watched more film this offseason than I did my entire season coaching at Winners Mill. So I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But we're going to move on to my first stock up, and I think it was Brandon Williams. I thought Brandon Williams had a very dominant year inside, and the defensive tackle nose guard position is such a hard position, Joe, to really quantify the impact because it's a lot like an offensive lineman. There isn't many hard statistics. I mean, I know you have your tackles and you have your sacks, but that doesn't really apply to a defensive tackle nose guard like a Brandon Williams because they're not going to get a lot of the tackles because they're usually the guy that gets a double team or even a triple team at times. And what makes them so good or when they can get that penetration in the run game and really blow some things up in the backfield. And that's what Brandon Williams was doing. You saw a lot of tackles for loss, a lot of penetration. Even in that Titan game, in the playoff game, when Derrick Henry ran all over them, if you watched and you watched closely, Brandon Williams was not a defensive lineman, Joe, that got pushed around in that game. He got penetration. He just didn't have anybody behind him to come up and make a play. So Brandon Williams, to me, every year we hear, oh, you need to cut Brandon Williams. It's ridiculous. You pay him that much money as a big boy and he doesn't rack up the sacks and all that stuff. Those are people that don't really understand the game and understand the value of a Brandon Williams. And that's why Ozzie Newsome gave him that big contract is because he is so valuable in stuffing the run. And we saw it in the game against the Browns when he wasn't there, man. Nick Chubb ran gangbusters all over the Baltimore Raven defense. He to me really solidified his value to me going forward in this Raven defense and made it to where you can let a Michael Pierce go because you've got Brandon Williams who does a better job than Michael Pierce.
I agree with you there. Brandon Williams had a great season. He's obviously not a defensive lineman that is an interior pass rusher. He hasn't had more than 2 sacks in a single season, but when it comes to stuffing the run, he's one of the best out there. And like you said, to have a guy who can potentially combat losing Michael Pierce in free agency, which I think is ultimately going to happen when it's all said and done, to have him there is huge for the Ravens' run defense. They still need to add some pieces around him, but to have that core guy who is heading into his who's going to be 31, I believe, going into next season, is still a guy that you count on in the middle of that defense and stuff to run in. The AFC North has some very talented running backs the Ravens will have to go up against. So I definitely agree with you there. He is a guy that is going to be a key piece for the Ravens defense. My next stock up is actually going to be Mark Andrews. It's a kind of obvious one, but it just goes to show how important he was to the Ravens passing game this year. He was their leading receiver and led all tight ends and touchdowns with 10 this year. He's a guy that I'm putting up in the top 4 of tight ends now. I don't think that's too far-fetched to say now in his second season, but he had a breakout year his rookie season, but I'd even call this even more of a breakout year for what he had. He was Lamar Jackson's security blanket, a guy who was able to go up and make those 50-50 ball contested catches. I know some people gave him flack for some of the drops he had in the beginning of the season, but man, the Ravens aren't where they're at if they're not without Mark Andrews this year. He is a guy who is going to continue to be a focal point for Lamar Jackson as the Ravens continue to add wide receivers around him. We kind of all predicted that with how this offense was going to look this season, that there was a good chance that a tight end could be the leading receiver. And man, every single game, it looks like even more and more like Mark Andrews is going to be a number 1 guy in Baltimore and continuing to develop to one of the most promising tight ends in the league. He is a lot of fun to watch. He is just such a big body target that's so good at finding spaces. If you watch some of the games and just watch how he can pick out holes in the defensive coverage and just be there for Lamar Jackson, be that first down security blanket there. He's a big guy. It is hard to tackle him. You've seen him try to run over 2 or 3 guys, hurtling sometimes, I know, which gives Ravens fans some heart attacks, him trying to hold on to the ball. But, man, he is a big guy, and he is hard to bring down. And Lamar Jackson was one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the red zone this season, and you can be when you have a guy like that who catches just about anything thrown his way.
Yeah, I am. Mark Andrews was gonna be on my list, but I figured you were gonna take him, so I didn't want to overlap you. I mean, he he made the leap to the point where honestly, you could look at Hayden Hurst and say, honestly, Hayden Hurst's stock went down because he didn't make the leap that Mark Andrews did. I don't think any of us really saw Mark Andrews doing what he did. I think we all honestly expected Hayden Hurst to be that guy that would really take this step and become that number one tight end. And what Mark Andrews did is what he did his rookie year. He was a solid, dependable pass catcher. He was there when Lamar Jackson needed to make a throw, like his rookie year against the Chargers when he made that great 67-yard touchdown catch. I mean, that's just the tight end Mark Andrews is. And if he continues to play at this level, Joe, I don't think it's out of the question to put Mark Andrews up in the category with George Kittle and Travis Kelce as one of the best tight ends in football. I think right now it's a little far fetched to put him in that category, but I could see it down the line as potentially he could be there if he continues on this upward track.
Yeah, to me, he's a top 5 guy right now. You're going to have Kittle and Kelsey and Zach Ertz. I even put former Raven Darren Waller potentially up in that conversation with how well he played with the Raiders, albeit just one season. But Andrews has now 2 very solid seasons, and there's no signs of him going to be slowing down, and he's going to continue to be a focal point in this offense. So I am of the belief that Lamar Jackson still has a lot of improvement to make as a passer, so that could come with a lot of development with Mark Andrews, and those two seem to have a great connection together, and I think that only continues to get better.
Yeah, so my second stock up option, I'm gonna go Bradley Bozeman. He was There was a lot. I remember there were a lot of questions coming into camp. Oh, who's going to be the left guard? And is Matt Skura even worth being a center going forward? All this stuff. Oh, we need to get a left guard. And I think Bradley Bozeman now, he's not an elite guard. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he was an elite guard, but I think he changed a lot of minds in Baltimore to where I think you can go into next year feeling very comfortable with Bradley Bozeman being your left guard because a lot like Matt Skura, even a lot like Marshall Yanda at times, very serviceable, very tough-nosed lineman. And that's huge because when you look at the offensive line, it's so important about continuity and having a consistent group across the front. And if you only have to tinker at one spot and you don't have to make a mass change, that's big. And Bradley Bozeman playing as well as he did this year really solidified the offensive line. And I think solidifies it going forward. When you look at really the only position you have to change will be Marshall Yanda when he retires. And you hope that's not for another year. And you can re-sign Ronnie Stanley and you're going to have a pretty good offensive line for years, not just a season. Not like what we saw with the Dallas Cowboys, where it was, oh, that's a really great offensive line, but they only had it for 2 years because they didn't re-sign everybody. The Ravens could have an offensive line that is good and dominant for 5 or 6 years to go with Lamar Jackson.
It goes hand in hand, not necessarily with Ronnie Stanley at how well they played, but just the offensive line as a whole. He was a very underrated piece of that that had a huge impact of how well the Ravens offense played. My third and final stock up guy is going to be Chuck Clark. And it almost goes hand in hand with one of my stock down guys that we're going to get into a little bit later. But to have a guy who was a former 6th-round pick step in and be your starting safety, and not only that, but to perform at high level it's just not very common to have that. Chuck Clark started 12 games this year. And more importantly, I think was the most impressive part was that he was wearing the green dot, being the head communicator of that defense. I mean, if you look at the talent on that team and how aggressive and how complex Wink Martindale has made that defense, to be able to get the guy that's coordinating that all on the field, you have to be an intelligent guy. And Chuck Clark was that guy for the Ravens defense this year. He's a piece that I could like to see with Earl Thomas next year. He's a guy that is going to be the replacement for Tony Jefferson when it comes down to it. Jefferson's probably going to be a guy who we see cut this offseason. But Chuck Clark was a very surprising stuck-up guy for me, when he took over for Jefferson after the Steelers game when he had the knee injury. I'm excited, and it's just good to have a guy on the back end there when we talk so much about how many pieces that Ravens need to add to the secondary after losing Eric Weddle. Who's going to be one of those guys that steps up? You sign Earl Thomas in free agency. Okay, who's going to be that guy you paired next to him? Tony Jefferson comes in, gets hurt. Chuck Clark comes in and replaces him. And the Ravens defense was better with Chuck Clark than it was with Tony Jefferson. It's just how it is. I mean, it's just if you watch the Ravens this year, they were a significantly better defense when they added those pieces mid-season, and Chuck Clark took over there. So he's a guy who's stuck up for me and is going to continue to be one of the Ravens' defensive leaders there next year, and probably the guy who's wearing the green dot again.
All right, I'm going to push back just a little bit here on Chuck Clark. I personally, serviceable safety, did an outstanding job, in my opinion, of handling, getting everybody lined up and whatnot. But, Joe, there was something that Tennessee game, and maybe I'm being overly critical, and you'll probably call me out on it, but he looked really bad in that playoff game. He didn't look like he wanted to come up making plays, and you need a safety that's willing to come up and hit because, look, Earl Thomas, and I might mention Earl here in a little bit, but he's going to make more business decisions now at 29, 30 years old than he is going to be willing to stick his nose in there. And I didn't see that out of Chuck Clark. And I know that was what he was supposed to be, was a hard hitter. I didn't see that, and that left a bad taste in my mouth to where I wonder what's Chuck Clark going to look like playing a whole year where teams have schemed against him, because he was out of position a lot of times in that Tennessee game, and that bothers me because I hate to say this because, like, Tom Brady was a 6th-round pick and all that stuff, but there are some reasons guys are that available that late in drafts, and I have a bad feeling if Chuck Clark plays 16 games and he doesn't have a veteran to kind of take some of the workload off of him, I think we're going to find some holes in Chuck Clark's game. So I'm a little hesitant, little reserved on Chuck Clark. He did a great job. I take nothing away from him in regards to how he handled lining up the defense, but his play himself left me with something to be desired, and I don't know if I can put his stock up. And honestly, you can debate me and call me crazy. I don't want to get rid of Tony Jefferson, not because I like the guy, but because he's your true blue strong safety, and you don't have one of those, and you need one of those, especially when you're facing running teams like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and it isn't Chuck Clark. That's what the Tennessee game showed to me. So I'll let you offer a rebuttal.
Yeah, well, listen, to the first point, if you're the Ravens and a team that was reportedly interested in the guy like Jamal Adams, bring him in. I'm not saying that Chuck Clark can be your starting safety for the next 5 years. I think just given the circumstances and where the Ravens were, he was definitely a guy that came in and played way better than I expected him to. And on the Tony Jefferson train, I don't see a scenario where he's back. That's just my personal opinion. It's the last year of his contract. He's a $7 million cap hit for the Ravens. It's just one of those things where his knee injury, from what reports made it out to seem, was probably more significant than just an ACL injury. There's no guarantee that he's back at the time, and I just did not think the Ravens defense played that well with him earlier in the season when they had a lot of lapses in coverage and a lot of issues in the secondary there. And yes, I agree with you to the fact that Earl Thomas at this stage in his career is not going to be a guy who's going to be coming up and making those hard hits and things like that. So yes, do the Ravens need pieces in the secondary, especially at safety, to maybe add some depth pieces and improve in that area? Absolutely. But if you're going to be a team that's going to invest in your secondary, you're going to make those commitments to Marcus Peters and then probably Marlon Humphrey coming up and potentially still keep guys around like Jimmy Smith and Brandon Carr, I think Chuck Clark's still a guy you can keep on the back end there for another year. And Wink Martindale has a knack for scheming up things where I feel comfortable with a guy who might not necessarily be the most talented guy on the field to be able to scheme him up in those situations where you can benefit from his talent and what he can do on the field.
I don't disagree with you. I have a take about Raven free agency coming up here in a little bit that probably is going to piss some Raven fans off. But let's see. Let's get to stock downs, Joe. I'll go first on stock down. And my first stock down is on Patrick Owasso. Biggest disappointment I've ever seen This was supposed to be a guy that was ready to take over the Mike linebacker position, be your easy replacement for C.J. Mosley to where you wouldn't miss C.J. Mosley, and he didn't do any of that. He was horrendous at times, committing stupid penalties, out of position, missing tackles. I mean, all the stuff that he did so well in 2018, he did horribly in 2019 to the point where it's like, okay, you know what? This is kind of what you get, guys, for trying to convert a safety to linebacker. You're going to get play like this at times. And guess what? Boy, Patrick Owasso, big stock down. In fact, if I was on the stock, Wall Street, it'd sell. Get rid of his stock because he isn't coming back.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We'll get into a little bit in the next couple of shows where we talk about some free agency preview, but I don't think he's back next year. My first stock down is Chris Moore. He's a guy who I didn't expect to be an all-world talent with Lamar Jackson and just this wide receiver core, but he was just very disappointing. He really had no impact on this offense whatsoever. He was almost a regular healthy scratch towards the end of the season and more of a special teams guy when it came to it. He was a guy who could just really never crack that top of the roster at wide receiver. And when you add in Marquise Brown and you keep around Willie Snead and then Miles Boykin comes in, he signed Seth Roberts. It really kind of threw Chris Moore on the back burner. He had some opportunities the previous year and the year before that when the Ravens wide receiver core was pretty much decimated. You had really no one else to throw the ball to. He showed some flashes, but I just expected so much more of him to step up. No pun intended there, but he's just a guy who I thought was just going to be a lot more involved in this Ravens offense this year. And the stock down's not that I expected them to be a 1,000-yard receiver. I just thought there would be more of a role, and there really wasn't.
Yeah, especially when you're considering that he was potentially going to step up and be a number 2 option to go along with Willie Snead, and he didn't do that. He didn't crack the lineup, which tells me one thing. I don't think he really understood the playbook very well, because to me that's just so much of the game for the receivers. Can you understand the routes? Can you understand the plays? I don't think we saw that out of Chris Moore. I don't want to hear the excuse from people. Oh, he didn't get enough touches. You have to earn the right to be on the field as an offensive receiver. And to me, obviously, Chris Moore did not do that. So it's very easy for me to agree with you and say that his stock is down to the point where he's not even worth bringing him back as a special teamer, because he's just not that good. He just isn't. I hate to be that rude, but I hope Chris, who listens to the show, doesn't take it the wrong way. But yeah, he just wasn't very good.
Yeah, I mean, they're gonna continue to upgrade the wide receiver core, which means people have to go, and he's going to be one of those guys that they don't keep around, especially if they're going to be drafting a guy or potentially signing a veteran free agent.
Yeah, and Seth Roberts, you can follow him out the door. My stock down number 2, Anthony Averett. Anthony Averett, I mean, to the point where they had to go out and acquire Marcus Peters because they didn't have the depth at corner, to the point where once they got Peters, you couldn't crack the lineup. Anthony Averett, big stock down, because I was hearing some good things about him. Thought maybe this would be the year. And I was going to also say Maurice Kennedy, but that's not fair to Maurice because he wasn't on the team that long after week 5. But boy, him and Averett had the opportunity to step up, and man, they got torched. And it's simple things. Maybe he can fix it. Maybe it'll be better. But his stock is way down to where right now, if we were doing roster cutdowns for next year, he would be on my chopping list because I don't see the value in him.
Yep, I'm right there with you. My next stock down is a combination between Cyrus Jones and DeAnthony Thomas. I've kind of talked about this the past couple of episodes, so it don't seem like I'm trying to be annoying, but the Ravens' return game was very underwhelming this season. You had Cyrus Jones, who coughed up a fumble against the Patriots. Obviously gets released, and then you bring in a guy, DeAnthony Thomas, who is an explosive guy but really doesn't show much. The Ravens didn't have much of a return game. Luckily, the offense was as efficient as they were. Really, where they started on the field didn't matter that much, but going forward, you want to have a consistent return guy, and the Ravens just really haven't had that. WBL's Bobby Trossett, who we had on last week, mentioned the possibility of Justice Hill as a returner. I think that could be interesting, although he did look a little uncomfortable back there returning some kicks. He is a rookie, so you do give him some time there, hopefully some practice. Could be a potential option down the road. But DeAnthony Thomas and just the entire return game was just very underwhelming to me. And for a team that has been so good in the special teams aspect, I thought they could have just been a lot better there. And both those guys deserve a stock down from me.
I agree. I mean, I think a lot of the issues for the Ravens really began and end offense at times because they were pinned on such long fields because they just wouldn't get any return yards. They seemed scared at times to run up and catch the ball and then try and get 3 or 4 yards. It's just you can't have that. So I would not be surprised if there isn't somebody back there. I don't know whether it be Justice Hill. Maybe you draft a receiver in the late rounds. It's a developmental project, but has a little speed you can put back there. I don't know. Something better than what you put back there for 16 games this year because I believe it cost you in a way in that playoff game. My third stock down isn't really that his stock went down, but he stayed the same, and that's not good. And that's Tyus Bowser. In a year, much like Patrick Owasso, where you needed linebackers to step up and make plays, I didn't see Tyus Bowser doing that much. He did it a little bit towards the end of the year, but I didn't see enough playmaking out of him. And he didn't really lose any value to me, but it's also in a way that since he didn't improve his stock, it actually hurt him a little bit. I think he needed to make a bigger impact this year, and I don't think he did. And I think that's going to hurt him going into camp next year. He was a guy that I thought needed to really improve this year, and he stayed about the same, which isn't awful. I mean, he's consistent at least at that, Joe, but he, to me, by not getting better, you actually hurt your value to this team going forward.
I think for depth purposes specifically, he'll be around because he heads into his fourth year of his, I think the final year of his rookie contract next year. So I think for depth purposes, with a looming decision on Matthew Judon, he'll be around because he is familiar with the defense. Excuse me. So yeah, I agree with you. I don't think he was anything worldly. He out of the two guys, him and Tim Williams, he was definitely the better of the two there that panned out. I think you could both label. I mean, when you're a second round pick and you haven't lived up to those expectations, an early second round pick, I definitely agree with you that we just haven't seen the production from him that you expect. He was a very athletic prospect coming out of Houston, and it just hasn't necessarily translated. We've seen him in spurts. There have been some times where he's made a sack or made a big play, and you're like, oh, there he is. Where has this been from Tyus Bowser the first 3 years of his career? And it just hasn't clicked. But how Raven would it be for him just to have some kind of breakout year in his fourth season, then just go into free agency and get paid? That's just like classic Ravens, just to do that. My third stock down. Go ahead.
It'd be like Daniil Ellerbe. Remember the year that they won the Super Bowl? Well, more so Daniil Ellerbe because I think Daniil Ellerbe has more of the skill set of Tyus Bowser. I've never understood why Tyus Bowser didn't get some looks at inside linebacker because he is rangy. I don't think at his size he's ever going to be a great pass rusher because he's undersized and those big offensive tackles will just swallow him up. I always kind of thought with his coverage skills, he wouldn't be bad at Mike, but obviously of course, Don Martindale and the linebacking crew has done it longer than I have, so they probably know that that's not a good option. So I agree with you. He's got the skill set, but I think he'll end up being like Daniil Ellerbe if it plays out like we think and hope, and he'll go get a big contract and disappoint.
Ravens fans love speculating any outside linebacker who could potentially play inside linebacker. It's like Tyus Bowser we talked about with Kamale Correa a couple years ago. Every time I hear that, it's like nails on the chalkboard to me. I don't know why, but just having been following the team and just following, I guess maybe it's just too much Twitter that just engulfs some kind of just toxic like energy into me when we talk about things like this. But just like when everyone's like, oh man, he should see some looks at inside linebacker. And I agree with you with Tyus Bowser to a point. This is not a shot at you whatsoever. I've just like heard so many times in the past for like, oh, let's see if this guy can move to inside linebacker because he's just not producing at outside linebacker. And I'm just like, all right, like, can we just give this up, please? Like, just to a point, it just annoys the hell out of me. I don't know.
Well, And here's I completely get it, and trust me, it's something that when you're coaching, you go through almost on a daily basis with players, prospects, all that sort of stuff. But what the thing with Bowser that makes me think he more than anybody else, I never looked at Camelin Correa as a guy that could play inside. He was too big, too bulky. He was an edge player. And I think I give him a lot of credit. He's looked much better in Tennessee than I think he ever would have here in Baltimore
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I think the ship had sailed. I just don't think he was ever going to be what he is in Tennessee with us. I don't think that was going to happen. But with Bowser, he's got a different skill set. Like you said, I'll never forget watching his highlight tapes in college, and he goes out and is covering Dalvin Cook in a bowl game. Like that's what your inside linebackers are typically doing. And he was an edge guy that was coming out making the plays. So that's where I get the logic. But to your point, Joe, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And those are people that don't know football that think, oh, okay, well, he can't produce an outside linebacker. Let's put him an inside linebacker and he'll produce better. It doesn't, trust me, it doesn't work like that. There are two different skill sets for that position. So I get where you're coming from with Ravens Twitter. It's Ravens Twitter is something else with their conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's like Crockett Gilmore. You remember him trying to like transition to an offensive lineman? Like, look how that worked out. When did you ever hear about him after? I mean, it's like, it amazes me just how people think. And granted, these are the most athletic guys in the world. They are in this position for a reason. You could give them the benefit of the doubt in some ends, but it's just completely just different to go from a position where your primary job is to rush the passer to an inside linebacker role. And I don't even know like I'm not even well versed in all of that stuff. I'm not going to act like I am, but just to the naked eye, like that just doesn't make sense to me. But to my final stock down, I was going to kind of follow the same train you did of a guy that necessarily didn't have a stock down, but didn't really see a stock up. And this might be a little unfair considering it was his rookie season, but I just thought we're going to see a little more of Ben Powers. Just with the offensive line, some questions. I know that Bradley Bozeman took that left guard spot, and then obviously you have Marshall Yanda at right guard, but he got beat out by Patrick McCarry and Bozeman at the time, and people talked up Ben Powers. He's a talented guy coming out of Oklahoma, and he did play well and when he had some starting action in the Week 17 game against Steelers, but we're in a position where Marshall Yanda could not be here next year, and that is a huge loss to the Ravens offensive line that immediately becomes one of their biggest needs. And we've talked about it a little bit. Is he a guy who you'd be confident in coming in, stepping up? The Ravens have a good track record of getting guys in the mid to late rounds and some of the drafted guys coming in and performing well. But to a point, if you're going to be a team that's going to be running the hell out of the ball and they have proven that that's where they want to go, you have to have a stout offensive line. And I just don't know. I just haven't seen enough of Ben Powers, and maybe that's just it. That's just kind of where I'm coming from. But I just expected him to put more of maybe some competition and more of a fight into that starting role. And it just really didn't pan out that way. Maybe it's just a lot of the learning curve coming into the year and his rookie year. And I know that's a big thing for first year players. And there's a lot of jumps from year one to year two. But I was just a little disappointed. I thought that I'd see a little more from him.
Oh, I agree with you. I think he's a guy. He could make the Bradley Bozeman jump, but honestly, he's gonna need an off season. I think to get bigger, get stronger. I think that was probably a big part of it. Was he was undersized, didn't have the physical strength, and it's kind of telling to me that a couple of the guys they signed, Hronis Grasu and Patrick Enlinger or whatever his name is, they signed both of them and they were jumping Ben Power. So obviously, like you said, there's something there that scared the Ravens off of playing him. And you're absolutely right. He had the opportunity. I mean, he was right there with Bozeman at the beginning of the year, and Illuminor and Skura and Macari as a possibility, and he got beat out by everybody except for Illuminor, who went to the Patriots and didn't do anything. But you're right. He's a disappointment. I'll be curious to see what happens with him next year, especially if Marshall Yanda retires. But I don't think Yanda's retiring, Joe.
I don't know. I can't really read it. He is a guy who just shows absolutely no emotion. And even Bobby, who was around the team pretty much all this year, didn't seem like anyone really has a good grasp of what's going on. Although when Bobby did allude to the fact that Marshall Yanda had a lot of family making kind of a sentimental moment after the game, I guess it depends how much you want to read into that. could just be an end of the season thing, or I mean, either way, he's had a Hall of Fame career in my book. I mean, even if you take away a little bit of bias, how consistent he's been. If you're a guy who studies football, and a lot of the guys who recognize Marshall Yanda aren't necessarily your casual football watchers outside of Baltimore, we all understand how good he is. But those guys who really dive into the film and break down the tape will vouch for it too. Marshall Yanda is one of the best interior offensive linemen in football, and continues to be at an older age. And that position, Dave, I'm sure gets even tougher as you get older, because it's a bang bang play every time in the trenches.
Oh yeah,
it's not a position where it's graceful to those who are getting older. You have to endure a ton of hits, and Marshall Yanda is just kind of your lunch pail kind of guy when it comes to that.
Yeah, I mean, the line you always hear with linemen, especially offensive linemen, is you're in a car wreck almost every play, and it takes a toll on your body. I mean, look, I played 4 years of high school. My knee hurts when I try to get in the stance. I got my hands, wrist hurts at times because you get so locked up and you're gripping pads and you get little bumps and bruises. I mean, that sort of stuff. The only thing that makes me think Marshall comes back is this. He talked about at times this year how much fun he had. And a lot of guys don't want to leave something that's fun. I mean, some of the guys that retire, you can tell that they were just done. I don't see that with Marshall Yondas. I think he's going to fulfill the end of the contract. But look, if he does retire, I think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, 8-time Pro Bowler, 2-time first team All Pro, 5-time second team All Pro. I mean, he's got the credentials that say he's going to get in. Now, I don't know if he's going to get in on the first ballot, because clearly the Pro Football Hall of Fame doesn't know how to equate offensive linemen, because Tony Baselli should be in the Hall of Fame, and I will go to my grave with that one. But he's a Hall of Famer if he does retire.
Yep, I'll bang on that drum all day long, and I've written too many articles about it. So, I mean, they could basically use what I've said as his argument to get in there. But what's your final stock down for this, if you had one?
I had Bowser. I had my 3.
Yep. Okay. I have my 3 as well.
Yeah.
I guess we could touch a little bit on some Super Bowl stuff. I watched it on Sunday. It was, I don't know. We talked about it before. I didn't have too much interest in it. I didn't think it was a great game. People were talking about, I mean, the last 10 minutes of the game was great. I didn't think Mahomes played fantastic. Jimmy G was not great. The halftime show was great. But,
I didn't watch it.
No, I mean, it was a good game. I just didn't think it was. It was a lot closer, and it seemed a lot better if you just looked at the box score maybe than just watching it. There was a lot of sloppy football, but two evenly matched teams, in my opinion, probably two of the best teams that got paired up together. And I guess if you're looking at it from the Ravens' perspective, 2 things. Number one, you're excited to see Terrell Suggs get his 2nd Super Bowl ring. A guy who didn't have a choice where he was going to go after he got released from the Cardinals, got claimed by the Chiefs, and got put into an ideal situation and won a second Super Bowl. He's a guy who I could see retiring and just kind of riding off into the sunset. No better way than to go up on top. We saw Ray Lewis do the kind of same thing. And I saw a couple of people making some conversation about some of the comments that Terrell Suggs had after the Super Bowl when he said that this one felt a little bit better than his first Super Bowl, but that got taken way out of context, in my opinion. He said it in the sense that this felt way better considering how his season began, playing with the Cardinals. The Cardinals aren't playing well. He gets released, doesn't know his future, and then comes on to the Chiefs and wins the Super Bowl. 2 completely different situations. If you're just trying to make something out of it, I think you're just doing it for the sake of conversation. Terrell Suggs obviously knows how much the Ravens means to him. He's spent his first 16 seasons in the NFL there. He'll retire as a Raven and ultimately get elected to the Hall of Fame as a Raven. So people who are making just anything out of it, just to me, I think it's just silly. He appreciates both Super Bowls, and when you're a player, there's only so many opportunities you get, and some don't even get an opportunity to win a Super Bowl. So to me, that was just making a lot out of nothing.
Well, and here's the other thing. I think if you look at the Suggs comments on face value, and I saw them, and I saw everybody overblowing it, when you get to the age that Terrell Suggs is, you appreciate it more. I mean, Suggs was 31, I believe, when they won that first Super Bowl back in 2012. So when you're that age, like Patrick Mahomes is probably going to wake up after the dust settles and think about, hey, I've got the opportunity for 3 or 4 more Super Bowls. Like, this is just the beginning. when you're at Terrell Suggs' point in your career and you're 37 and you win a Super Bowl, you appreciate it more because you realize this is probably it. This is the closest I'm ever going to get to winning another Super Bowl and having this feeling. So I think that's where he's coming from in his comments. It wasn't a dig at the Ravens because he loved every minute being a Raven. It just comes when you're at that age. It's that, wow, this is such a special feeling. I know I may never get this feeling again. Like my career may end and I only get this one more opportunity. So I'm going to soak it up as much as possible, which is why, like you said, part of it was he was on such a bad team that when he landed in Kansas City and they went on this run, it's like, man, I got to appreciate this because I may end up next year if I decide to come back playing for like an Arizona or Cincinnati, just throwing out a bad team. And I may never get this experience again. I may never get as close as I'm getting right now to winning the Super Bowl. So that's where I think Suggs' comments are. And again, I know we're an ultra sensitive city here in Baltimore. We get it. We get bashed by everybody. We're described as the wire city. You can't take everything a former player says personally. Now, Bernard Pollard, fuck that guy, Joe. Fuck him. He can I apologize for cursing, but he can go eat a bag of you know what. But Terrell Suggs, now, you take it with a grain of salt here, folks. He wasn't taking a shot at the city. He was just talking about the moment. And to me, the Super Bowl itself, I thought it was entertaining. It had its moments. There was some good defense. The Niner defense was awful at the end of the game when it really needed to be. But I was happy Dan Williams, our buddy, winning a Super Bowl. So I was happy for him that he got that. But I mean, it was underwhelming because I didn't have a real rooting interest in the game. I was just watching because I'm a football junkie, and this was my last game until August. So there you go.
Oh, don't diss XFL like that. Come on.
Okay, here's what happened. All right, I dissed the AAF. Then I went, okay, the games are semi-interesting. Started to watch a little bit. Then the damn league folded. And I got to buy into the XFL because I know as soon as I do, the XFL is going to be like, hey, we're going to close doors here, Bunky. We're done. See you later. So I'm not overly hyped about this because I don't think this is another sustainable league. I just don't think you're going to get the NFL anywhere else but the NFL, Joe.
Oh man, DC Defenders till I die. Cardell Jones, come on, man. I'm all for it. Give me some football. I know it's not going to be the NFL, but I'll buy into anything. It's going to be hot for the first couple of weeks and probably die down. But at 2 p.m. on Saturday, DC Defenders, man, I'm in front of the TV. All me.
I think I need to see what the actual football product is. Look,
Yeah.
I'll watch a lot of football. I'll watch a lot of bad NFL football. I'm not going to watch bad collegiate football or bad semi-pro football. So that's where I come from because I'll just get annoyed and frustrated watching poor execution. So I'm going to give it a week, see what it looks like in some highlights, and then maybe if it grabs my interest, I'll put it in the rundown of channels as I'm flipping between college basketball.
Some former Ravens in the XFL. Reynolds, Will Hill, Nico Siragusa. So if anything, a little bit of rooting interest there.
By the way, I want to say this before we get out of here. Raven fans, and look, I'm partially to blame. I got excited. Maybe we'll get Yannick Ngakoue and all this stuff. You have to understand this Raven front office. They have never been big spenders. And that's why 30 million, Joe, they may not make any roster cuts because 30 million is a lot more money than they've had in years past. And they've been able to pull some really nice deals off. So Raven fans, don't get upset. Don't get frustrated with the organization if they don't make the big splashy moves and go get a top guy. Maybe they get a Vic Beasley. Maybe they get a Calais Campbell, as I saw from Jamison Hensley, ESPN, in the ESPN NFL prediction column that they had. I think a Calais Campbell's the perfect type of Raven signing. He'd be a cap casualty. He'd be exactly what you needed in the interior defensive line. Don't expect the Ravens to go out and spend a lot of money because This just isn't their game. It never has been, and it just never will be. DaCosta will use that $30 million very sparingly. I think he'll sign a lot of B-level guys, and you know what? Come the season time, you're going to sit there and go, damn, he put a pretty good product on the field for the guys he's got.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say before we wrap things up is the teams that have a lot of cap space are there for a reason. The teams who make big splashes consistently on the free agent market doesn't necessarily equate to winning on the field, i.e. the New York Jets this past offseason. So the Ravens know what they're doing. They've had Ozzie Newsome down. Now Eric DaCosta is general manager, so just trust what they do. Trust that they're going to put the team in a good position. And like Brian McFarland said, they've already done a lot of their work already this season, extending guys. So it may not seem like they're making many moves, but they made a lot of moves late last offseason, all throughout this season to prepare coming up to the 2020 offseason.
Right. And look, $30 million is it, with a good GM, you can make a lot of moves that can improve your ball club. So don't fall into that. And I know people, look, I'm a Tony Jefferson guy. I'm a Brandon Carr guy, definitely. And I'll mention why in a minute. But they don't necessarily need to cut anybody, really. They don't have that much dead money. They're not up against the cap. So don't be surprised if Tony Jefferson is back and Brandon Carr is back next year, because they don't really have to make the moves because, like you said, and I've said, they've made a lot of moves already, and they never are a big splash team. Like, look at the Oakland Raiders. They're probably going to go pay $40 million for Tom Brady, and it isn't going to work out, Joe. So there you go.
I will be surprised if Tony Jefferson's back, but that's a story for a different podcast.
I also think, I'll just say this, Jefferson may come back he may restructure. I know it's not the fiscal thing, or he may take a pay cut, but he's the sort of guy I think wants to come back. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's not out there, which, again, it would free Chuck Clark up to maybe play a little more of that dime linebacker, or even maybe free Jefferson up to do that. But the last thing I'll say, we are really excited to say that we will have Brandon Carr interview at probably early April, Joe. Is that what we're looking at here for Brandon Carr? Because I'll be down at the Ed Block Courage Awards. He's a Ravens recipient, so it'll be a fun time, and we'll have Brandon Carr on the show at some point.
You'll be the guy coordinating the interview. From everything, it seems like Brandon Carr's a pro on and off the field, so he'll be a great guy. Cannot wait to add that in and have you guys be able to listen to it.
Yeah, so it's a little long-range tease, but it's worth it, and you'll be able to hear other great player interviews across the Brawl Network, and that is going to do it for us. Joe Schiller and I will be back next week to continue to go through the NFL offseason. We'll look at some draft prospects, and we'll just talk football and talk shop. So that is going to do it for the Ravens Brawl Podcast, a part of the Brawl Network. We will be back next week. For Joe Schiller, I'm Dave Steinwaddle. So long. Have a great week, everybody.